Welcome to another indie book review. Now, I mentioned before that I've been having a great time with these, and this one is no different. Today, we are tackling Monstrosity by Laura Diaz de Arce, and this was one of the surprise hits for me. I started reading this one because it seemed a lot different than the other books I was reading, and I kind of needed a palate cleanser. Now, if you look at the cover, and can we appreciate this cover? Whew, loved it. Love it every time I see it on my Twitter feed. You might think that this book is horror. And yes, there are a lot of horror elements to it. I mean, it's titled Monstrosity. However, there's a lot of sci-fi in it as well. A lot of the stories are just like out and out sci-fi. And those were probably my favorite overall. Now, because there's so many stories, I want to at least give you a quick rundown of each, and then I'll focus the most on my personal favorites. And of course, I can only say so much because they're all only so long, and most of them have some kind of like shocking twist or otherwise things that I don't want to spoil, so I can even say less about them. But there are three main sections. Let me pull up the book. Hominum, which is basically people doing or being things that would be seen as weird or monstrous. That could be anything from morally monstrous to things like mental illness that may make them seem as weird. And I'm sorry if I'm butchering these names. Mutatio? I'm not quite sure what language that's supposed to be, if it's Latin or Spanish. Which is humans changing into monsters or into other creatures. And the last one is monstrum, and that is flat out these beings have always been and will always be monsters. So you've got three nice, the sections kind of blend into each other, all human, human to monster, monster. So it's almost like the sections kind of tell their own story in a way. So let's jump right into it with my notes right here. And the first story, which I found out led another reader to insta-DNF it with the 1 star, and we'll get to that in a second, is called Without Him and Him and Him, There Is No Me. And this is essentially about a nameless gold digger, more or less, who basically changes herself, changes who she is based on the guy she wants to get. Like, she doesn't start dating a guy and then changed slowly over time because of his influence. She flat out says, okay, I want this dude. What do I gotta do to get this dude? And changes herself then. And it's almost like a game to her. And the 1 star review, because as I was going to Amazon to review it, because you always gotta go to Amazon to review the indie books you read, one guy or a girl put 1 star that they had to stop reading after like the second page because it was so filthy and perverted. To which I thought, that's what some of us are here for. The voice in this one is fantastic, but we are talking morally ambiguous here. Next up, we have 3 Beats Per Measure, and this is essentially the idea of a young woman who may be a psychopath. The story explains it as being anger, and she has this anger that like leads her to want to do crazy things, but she finds this music might be able to do it, but can it wholly keep it back? That one, it was hard for me because I couldn't quite understand, figure out if it was a wholly new idea, this anger, or if she was trying to put a specific already existing mental illness into a different context. So that one might be my least favorite. Next up was probably the most tragic and heartbreaking one, and that is Some Dreams Just Aren't Worth the Trouble. It's about a woman who was an ex-pageant queen and who's both bipolar and a drug addict who decides that she can fly, and that it's heart-wrenching. It's probably the saddest story in there, so if you really can't handle super sad things, that one might not be the one for you. The next one was probably the best for diverse rep. Now, I believe Laura is somewhere on the LGBT spectrum. Correct me if I'm wrong, or Twitter Mutual, she can get at me or comment down below. But she's also at least half Chilean. I don't know what the other half of her ancestry is, but the next story, how Eduardo found his heart, is told in Spanglish, which is basically switching rapidly between Spanish and English. There's an author's note at the beginning that explains that she grew up in a bilingual household, and so this is just how she grew up. Now, you don't have to speak Spanish to understand the gist of the story. The gist of the story is it's based on, I believe, a Chilean folktale, basically about a guy who has never fallen in love and is told that, oh, there's a switch that seals hearts. So he goes off to find the switch and get his heart back, and he finds out she's not a witch, and maybe she's kind of nice. And it goes on from there. I'm pretty sure that there's probably like some subtleties or some nuances that you'll probably get better if you do speak both English and Spanish, but the story is still sweet. You still get the gist of it, and if like you know the barest of Spanish, like you can, like you've tried reading maybe signs you saw out in public, you can mostly get what it's saying. But yeah, I would definitely be interested if someone who was bilingual in both those languages read it and what they got from it. Next up was the beginning of our second section, which is Mutatio. The Swamp King. A young girl makes a deal with an old king to get rid of her abusive father, and that debt has to be repaid. I liked this one. They didn't go where I expected it to. It was also very fairy tale-esque, similar to the Eduardo story. I don't know if it's based on any folklore or was totally made up, but it definitely had that feel, or that sort of same tone and tenor as a folktale or a fairy tale. The next one was called Change, and this is all about a girl who finds out that she is a vessel, and in their world, vessels basically on their birthday, I believe 17th or 18th birthday, they basically, the story doesn't tell you until the end, and I don't really want to describe it because it's really gruesome, but basically they have to get the goddess out of her. This is probably the worst second worst. This is the second worst for gore. So if you're not into that kind of thing, you might want to skip this one. It's very heartbreaking in that scene of the ritual is, but it also is also very heart-wrenching. Next up, this was also very heart-wrenching, but for an entirely different way. This is called A Promise. And this was probably the first out-and-out total sci-fi story in which a woman is traveling to a new planet to be terraformed, only she's basically going to be using herself to terraform. And you're not sure how exactly, but you find out that her people, her going back to ancient times, had this way to adapt in surprising ways, and science basically found a way to speed up the adaptation process, and so send members of this lineage forward to forcibly adapt themselves, and I'm trying not to give it away, forcibly adapt themselves to terraform new planets. Now, this one was very intriguing to me because, when she spoke about her family, she had multiple partners, which I believe it was polyamorous. It wasn't like a husband and an ex-husband or a reverse harem. Like, I believe it was polyamory, and she had 2 kids, and when she referred to her 2 kids in pronouns, it was the zir gender neutral pronouns, and I don't know if that's something that she really wanted to represent, or if it was just the idea of this is the future, this is what everyone will be then. But that was definitely the most out and out sci-fi, and I mentioned to Laura when we were talking on Twitter one day that the sci-fi stories were definitely my favorite, and she goes, yeah, I figured they would be, which, like, yeah, I don't know when I became the sci-fi queen, but here we are. This one is very sad and very sweet because basically in the process of using her body to terraform, she's never seeing her family again. It's a one and done process, but she has to do it because the planet they're on is dying and they need a new one. So this is very much a death, suicide mission more or less before a good cause. So, and she's not like totally dead at the end. It's hard to explain. It's sci-fi, but this one was very sad. But I also did like the the aspect of having a sci-fi that was very, very heritage based rather than just being like, oh yeah, it's sci-fi, everything's homogenous, everything's like it was still based in Hispanic, I believe Aztec or Incan or Mayan, one of that set ancient heritage. So it was sci-fi with a very placey, very own voices feel. And there's a lot of that throughout the entire story, all the stories throughout the entire collection. You can feel the Hispanic culture come through, and it's very cool to see that culture come through in a sci-fi or a horror or something trippy like that. Next up was what, again, very out-and-out sci-fi, and one of my favorites, and that was called Plum Moon. This was about a group of astronauts who are going to a planet to attempt to drill, to look for the minerals that this essentially very hungry galactic corporation needs. And they find out that the planet doesn't seem to have any life on it, but the planet itself might be a thing. And it's kind of latched on to one of the astronauts who seems to be very fascinated with it. This one was probably the best for perspective. The main character definitely had a different perspective than everyone else, and her feelings and the way they were articulated was very fascinating, and things she thought about the planet when everyone else thought it was creepy and like everyone else kind of got weird vibes. She was very enthralled with it and wished that she could go walk on the surface without a suit and all that. So I definitely got the feeling of not quite being ostracized, but no one else quite gets what you're talking about. And the ending was, again, this is the mutatio portion, so people get changed into other stuff, and that, a lot of change. Also, an FF romance in it. It was a side romance, but still appreciated. And there was a lot of that. There was a lot of queerness, just sprinkled. Queerness and Hispanic own voices sprinkled through all of these horror and sci-fi stories, and I loved it. Next up was Roja, which was not that she turned into something, but the story turned into something. I'm trying to not give this away. A young girl goes walking in the woods on the verge of making a big family decision that she has to go back and essentially go to another country. I want to say it was Peru, but now I'm blanking and I didn't write it down. Basically to take care of her grandmother, so she goes for a walk in the woods to clear her head, and she finds a mysterious cabin with a mysterious man. But without giving it away, it does not go the way you think it does. It goes in an entirely different direction, and I really appreciate it because that premise could have so easily been cliche and a trope, and she went the other way. So I appreciated that. Turning the page to my notes. Okay, Mandible. Now we are in the actual straight up monstrum. People here are not wholly human. And Mandible is about 4 sisters who I don't think there's, I can't think of a name to what they are, but basically they can hold the form of human females, but other times when they're feeding, their faces transform and giant mandibles come out, and they communicate through clicking, and there's a hunter coming after them, and at the end of the day, it's about the idea of, well, yeah, they attack humans, but they attack humans to eat, and is it monstrous to attack humans to eat, and at what point would you start enjoying it? And if it's you don't enjoy it, but you need it to for sustenance, are you still a monster? And that kind of a lot of deep philosophical points in a very short story that I really appreciated, and a delightful twist on some people's identities. Now the next up was probably I'll say my second favorite. The West Hamberline Bordello opens at 5. This is in the future where androids basically, they're not running things, but they're everywhere. And this is about a android prostitute gaining her own identity. More or less, this prostitute called Joan, who basically can be reformatted or reprogrammed to have whatever kink identity that the customer wants, starts basically putting together a core identity from all of the other programs, and basically decides to become her own person and has to escape being an android prostitute. I, more than any one other of these, more than any other one of these. This is the story that I could have seen becoming a whole book. This idea of, similar to Detroit Become Human, if you know anything about video games, it's very similar to that premise of if you make androids super, super human, at what point do they just become human? And the idea of, is it okay to have this kind of, if we can give them human-esque thoughts, is it still okay to force them to do this kind of thing? And there's a lot of world building and a lot of big thoughts, and I would have loved an entire novel of that. Last step was my absolute favorite, and that was called Hardcover Softcover, and just the mix, because on one hand you have a succubus who is raising this 13-year-old girl because her human mother basically gave her to her. And she runs, and it's technically a bookstore, but the main selling point for her is the erotica she sells, because she is still a succubus and she's still got to feed off that energy, but she doesn't want to go out hunting because of her daughter. And she ends up having to fight city bylaws and city ordinances, and just the strange meeting of ancient succubus has to fight city council. The mix of this ancient, powerful being that's been around for forever and can remember biblical times has to fight something as banal as city government. That just made me laugh and also brought up some great points and was probably my ultimate favorite. And wow, I've spent over 15 minutes gushing about that. In general, I usually only read short stories when they're all horror, because for me, that's where short stories are at their best. However, I loved the sci-fi. It is really hard to get decent world building that doesn't feel too much look sci-fi in a novel, so that she can get that across in a couple thousand words was really impressive. The book is not too long. I believe I read it in Kindle form, but I believe it's only a couple hundred pages, and it's fantastic. I would definitely suggest it. 5 stars. Just look at the cover. Look at it. She put so much effort into it, and it shows. And I would definitely read other books by Laura if and when she publishes full novels. I know some people are only about the short stories, but me, I like a novel, and especially a sci-fi. She came out with a sci-fi novel, I would be all over that, because just the mix of, yeah, it's sci-fi, but I'm not doing the homogenous white guy sci-fi. This is going to be me as a Hispanic woman sci-fi. As Laura, I'm not, whatever. I would suggest you read this, especially if you love sci-fi. You do need to like sci-fi and gruesome things. There's really only 1 or 2 contemporary-esque stories in there, so you're really going to need to like the weird and the futuristic and the creepy and the gruesome to get into this, but if you like those things, you'll love this. And I have gushed for long enough. This is one of my longer reviews, but in my defense, I really wanted to go through every story piece by piece. I really don't have that many notes aside from the Spanglish made it a little bit difficult, but she wrote it that way for a reason, so it was an artistic choice, and I can't really get on her for that. I loved the rep. I loved all the queerness. It was great. So if you would like to check this out, please do. It is out. This technically wasn't an ARC. It was a review copy, but I don't mind. I really appreciated that I got it in the first place. I hope that you've been enjoying all these reviews. There's plenty more to come. Like, comment, subscribe, all that nonsense. And with nothing else to say, I hope you have a wonderful day and a marvelous tomorrow.